Arthur stood near the towering ice sculpture of a rearing stallion, nursing a lukewarm club soda. In the grand ballroom of the Sterling estate, he was known not as Arthur Penhaligon, the quiet archivist with a doctorate in medieval lineage, but simply as Seraphina's husband. He was an accessory, and a poorly chosen one at that, like wearing tweed to a black tie gala. Seraphina moved through the crowd like a diamond caught in a spotlight. She was radiant, sharp, and utterly terrifying. Tonight was her night. The air smelled of expensive imported lilies, champagne, and the subtle, metallic scent of old money vibrating with anticipation. "Where is that useless man of mine?" Seraphina's voice cut through the ambient noise of the string quartet. She was holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by senators and tech moguls. Arthur didn't move. He was used to this game. If he stepped forward, he was interrupting. If he stayed back, he was hiding. "There he is," she laughed, pointing her champagne flute at him like a conductor's baton. The spotlight of attention swung toward him. "Arthur, darling, try not to melt the ice sculpture with your intense brooding. We were just discussing the future of quantum computing, but I told them you're still trying to figure out how the printing press works." A polite ripple of laughter went through her circle. They didn't laugh because it was funny. They laughed because Seraphina Sterling was rich, beautiful, and cruel, and it was safer to be on the side of the hammer than the nail. Arthur merely raised his glass in a silent toast to his own irrelevance. He was the fool because he valued history over hype and quiet observation over loud declarations of wealth. He had married Seraphina 5 years ago, mesmerized by her fire, only to realize too late that fire does not warm, it only consumes. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in performative affluence. Each course seemed designed not for taste, but to emphasize the distance between the Sterlings and the rest of reality. Arthur sat at the far end of the head table, separated from his wife by 6 feet of damask tablecloth and an insurmountable canyon of disdain. He watched her operate. Seraphina didn't just converse. She extracted information and dispensed judgment. She was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely hollow. "My Arthur," she said loudly during a lull between the lobster course and the wagyu beef, addressing the entire table of 50 guests. "He spends his days dusting off scrolls that no one has cared about for 300 years. I keep telling him, 'Darling, the past doesn't pay the bills.' But he's a romantic fool. He thinks there's nobility in poverty." She looked down the table at him, her eyes glittering like cold sapphires. "Tell them, Arthur. Tell Mr. Henderson here about that fascinating 13th century sheep tax you were droning on about this morning." Mr. Henderson, a banking titan, looked mildly horrified at the prospect. Arthur dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. His heart hammered against his ribs, a familiar, dull ache of humiliation. "I believe Mr. Henderson prefers to discuss assets that exist in the present tense, Seraphina." "See?" Seraphina laughed, tossing her head back. "He admits it. A fool in his dusty books. Thank God one of us knows how to live in the real world." The table laughed again. Arthur swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He looked down at his hands, calloused from handling ancient vellum. They were honest hands. Tonight, surrounded by the soft, manicured hands of thieves and speculators, they felt alien. He didn't know it yet, but this was the last meal he would ever eat as a fool. At 9 o'clock, the great oak doors at the end of the ballroom swung open, and the music died instantly. Magnus Sterling had arrived. Seraphina's father was a man built of granite and malice. He didn't walk. He occupied space, displacing lesser beings as he moved toward the dais. Magnus had tolerated Arthur's presence in the family the way one tolerates a mild, persistent cough, an annoyance, but not life-threatening. He respected only 2 things: the accumulation of power and the ruthless exercise of it. Seraphina hurried to her father's side, her posture shifting subtly from dominant predator to eager heiress. They stood together on the raised platform, 2 titans of industry looking down on their subjects. "Tonight," Magnus began, his voice a low rumble that didn't require a microphone, "is about legacy. My legacy. A Sterling does not build sandcastles. We build fortresses." He placed a heavy hand on Seraphina's shoulder. She beamed under his touch, a rare moment of genuine vulnerability in her eyes. She wanted his approval more than she wanted air. For 30 years, sterling global logistics has been the vein through which the world's commerce flows, Magnus continued. But a king must eventually step aside. A true legacy requires a successor who is sharper, faster, and hungrier than the generation before. Arthur watched from the shadows of a marble pillar. He knew what was coming. They all did. This entire evening was a coronation. Magnus gestured to a pedestal where a velvet-covered object lay. With a dramatic flourish, he pulled the cloth away to reveal a heavy, bronze plaque. "It is my great honor," Magnus declared, "to announce that as of midnight tonight, I am stepping down as CEO. And I am handing full control of our newest subsidiary, the $80 million Apex Dynamics division, to the only person capable of wielding it. My daughter, Seraphina Sterling." The room erupted in applause. Champagne corks popped like celebratory gunfire. Seraphina looked triumphant. This was it. The validation she had craved her entire life. She was no longer just a socialite. She was a titan in her own right. She stepped to the microphone, clutching the bronze plaque like a newborn child. "Thank you, Father," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, Apex Dynamics will not just lead the market, it will crush it." Then, as if by reflex, her eyes sought out Arthur in the shadows. Even in her moment of ultimate triumph, she needed someone to stand on. "And I want to thank my husband, Arthur," she said, her tone shifting back to that familiar, saccharine cruelty, "for showing me every day exactly what I don't want to be. His commitment to being utterly inconsequential has been a tremendous motivator for my own ambition. To the fools who dream, so the rest of us can rule." She raised her glass. The room toasted her cruelty as if it were wit. Arthur felt a piece of his soul shrivel and die. He turned to leave, desperate for the cold night air, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of their golden cage. Arthur was halfway to the terrace doors when the crowd parted, not for him, but around someone else. A man was walking directly toward Arthur against the flow of the celebrating guests. He didn't belong here. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that was impeccably tailored but curiously out of fashion, like something from the 1950s. He was older, perhaps 60, with hair the color of steel wool and eyes that seemed to have seen continents rise and fall. He moved with a singular, terrifying purpose. He didn't acknowledge the senators or the billionaires. He only saw Arthur. Seraphina, still on the dais, noticed the disturbance. "Who is that?" she demanded into the microphone. "Security, we seem to have a crasher." The man ignored her. He stopped directly in front of Arthur, blocking his escape. Up close, Arthur realized he knew this man, or rather, he knew his type. He had the ink-stained fingers and the quiet intensity of a fellow archivist, a keeper of secrets. The stranger reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with burgundy wax. The seal wasn't the sterling S. It was a crest Arthur recognized from his oldest, most obscure history books. A crest of a lion dormant, guarding a key. The ballroom had gone quiet. The sheer audacity of this gray stranger interrupting Seraphina's coronation held everyone captive. Seraphina looked furious, descending from the dais, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she marched toward them. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, reaching the stranger. "Get out of my house before I have you thrown out." The stranger did not even blink. He continued to look only at Arthur. He held out the envelope. Arthur hesitated. His whole life with Seraphina had been about knowing his place, staying quiet, accepting the role of the fool. Taking that envelope felt like an act of rebellion he wasn't sure he could survive. "Take it, Mr. Penhaligon," the stranger said. His voice was gravel and old parchment. It wasn't a request. Arthur reached out. His hand trembled slightly as his fingers brushed the cold wax seal. He took the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be. It felt dense, loaded with potential energy. Seraphina grabbed Arthur's arm, her nails digging into his flesh. "Arthur, don't you dare open that. Give it to me. This is some cheap trick, some beggar trying to." The stranger turned his head and looked at Seraphina for the first time. The look was one of profound, ancient pity. It stopped her mid-sentence. He looked back to Arthur. He didn't smile. He didn't offer comfort. He simply gave an order that would shatter the world they were standing in. "Speak," the stranger said. The word hung in the air, heavier than the crystal chandeliers above them. Seraphina's grip on Arthur's arm tightened to the point of pain. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for him. "Give that to me and stop making a scene. You are embarrassing me on the most important night of my life." For 5 years, that tone had been enough to make Arthur shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But tonight, the weight of the envelope in his hands felt like an anchor keeping him steady against her current. He looked at the wax seal, the dormant lion guarding a key. It was the crest of a lineage thought to have died out 3 centuries ago. A lineage of scholars and keepers, not warriors or merchants. Arthur pulled his arm away from his wife. It was a small movement, but the shock on Seraphina's face was monumental. He had never pulled away before. With trembling fingers, he hooked his thumb under the burgundy wax. It snapped with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Magnus Sterling stepped down from the dais, his face purple with rage. Security. Seize this man and the lunatic who brought him something. Now. 3 burly security guards started toward them. The gray messenger didn't even turn his head. He simply held up a single hand, palm out. It was a gesture of absolute authority, and inexplicably, the guards stopped in their tracks, looking nervously at their employer. Arthur reached inside the envelope and pulled out the contents. It wasn't modern paper. It was thick vellum, yellowed with age, smelling faintly of ozone and dried lavender. His hands, so used to handling delicate history, stopped trembling instantly. This was his territory now. Seraphina snatched at the document, but Arthur pivoted smoothly, shielding it with his body. "It's too old for your hands, Seraphina," he said quietly. "You have no respect for the past. You'll crumble it." "What is that trash?" Magnus bellowed, arriving at their side. "Some forgery you bought to try and impress us, boy?" Arthur ignored them both. His eyes scanned the intricate calligraphy. It was Latin, written in a specific chancery hand from the mid-17th century. He recognized the style immediately. He had written his dissertation on the land grants of the Restoration period. His heart began to pound, not with fear, but with an intoxicating realization. He knew what this was. He had spent years searching for rumors of this document in dusty archives, believing it lost to fire or time. The vellum wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a bomb sitting in the middle of the Sterling Empire. Arthur looked up. He didn't look at Seraphina or Magnus. He looked at the gray stranger, who gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. Arthur took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of expensive lilies and the sudden, coppery smell of fear coming from the people around him. He found his voice. It wasn't the quiet mumble of the archivist husband. It was the clear, resonant voice of a man stating irrefutable facts. "This," Arthur began, holding up the vellum so the light caught the ancient ink, "is the Royal Charter of 1662, granted by King Charles II to one Thomas Penhaligon, for services rendered to the crown during the exile. Nobody cares about your dead relatives, Arthur." Seraphina shrieked, terrified by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The guests were no longer looking at her with envy. They were looking at Arthur with rapt attention. "You should care, Seraphina," Arthur said, his voice cutting through her panic. "Because Thomas Penhaligon was my direct ancestor. And this charter grants him and his heirs perpetual, irrevocable ownership of the land known then as Blackwood Rise." He paused, letting the history settle over the room. "Magnus," Arthur turned to his father-in-law, who looked ready to stroke out. "You are a developer. Tell these good people where Blackwood Rise is located today." Magnus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He knew. Every developer in the city knew the old names of the districts. "Allow me," Arthur continued, his voice hardening. "Blackwood Rise includes the entirety of the financial district, the docklands, and the 90 acres upon which this estate currently sits." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The senator dropped his champagne glass. It shattered, a fitting soundtrack for the moment. "Lies," Magnus finally roared, finding his voice. "That land was bought fair and square by my grandfather 80 years ago." "Your grandfather bought a lease." The gray stranger spoke up for the second time that night. His voice was dry as dust, but it carried to every corner of the room. He stepped forward to stand beside Arthur. "My name is Archibald Croft, senior partner at Croft and Sons Solicitors, London. We have managed the Penhaligon Dormant Trust for 300 years. The family, Arthur's family, preferred quiet stewardship over gaudy displays of wealth. They leased their vast holdings on 99-year terms, content to let others build upon their soil while they collected ground rent and lived quietly in the country. Mr. Croft pulled a modern, sleek tablet from his own pocket and tapped the screen. The lease for the land beneath the Sterling estate, and indeed the land beneath the headquarters of your new company, Apex Dynamics, was signed in 1925. He looked at his watch. It expired at midnight tonight, exactly 12 minutes ago. Seraphina looked from the lawyer to Arthur, her face draining of all color. The $80 million company her father had just gifted her, the crown she had just placed on her own head, was built on land she didn't own. "You're insane," Seraphina whispered, her voice trembling. "You're a penniless historian. You don't own all of this." Arthur looked around the opulent ballroom, at the marble columns, the gold leaf trim, the ice sculpture that was beginning to drip onto the floor. He saw it all differently now. He didn't see wealth. He saw tenancy. "I am a historian, Seraphina," Arthur said softly, "which means I know that everything eventually returns to its source. You call me a fool for living in the past, but the past just caught up with you." He looked at Magnus, who was frantically typing on his phone, no doubt trying to reach his own lawyers. "You can call whoever you like, Magnus," Arthur said. "But Mr. Croft has already filed the reversion papers with the city. As of 12 minutes ago, all structures on Blackwood Rise have reverted to the landowner upon expiration of the lease." Arthur took a step closer to Seraphina. The smell of her perfume, once intoxicating, now just smelled cloying. "Which means, wife," Arthur said, savoring the word, "that $80 million company, and this house, they are currently trespassing on my property." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the silence of 100 powerful predators realizing they were actually prey. Magnus Sterling looked defeated. He understood contracts, and he knew the terrifying finality of an expired ground lease held by an old money London firm. He slumped against the dais, suddenly looking like a very old man. Seraphina, however, couldn't process it. Her reality had fractured. She looked at Arthur, the man she had mocked during the appetizer course, the man whose tuxedo she had criticized in the limo, and she couldn't reconcile him with the man holding the vellum scroll. "Arthur," she stammered, trying to find that charming, manipulative smile that had always worked before. "Darling, this is wonderful, isn't it? We're rich. Richer than we imagined. We can run this together. You and me, the power couple." Arthur looked at her. He really looked at her, for the first time in years, without the rose-colored glasses of his own infatuation. He saw the fear in her eyes, but more than that, he saw the unwavering avarice. She didn't see him. She just saw a bigger bank account to attach herself to. He turned to Mr. Croft. "Archibald, I believe the terms of the expired lease allow for an immediate eviction notice if the tenants are deemed undesirable?" "Indeed they do, Mr. Penhaligon," Croft replied smoothly. "Shall I have the paperwork drawn up now?" Arthur looked back at his wife, the woman who had called him a fool in front of the world an hour ago. "Yes," Arthur said. "I think it's time for the fools to rule." "You can't do this," Seraphina's voice was shrill, cracking under the strain of her dissolving reality. "This is my house. I grew up here. These are my guests." Arthur looked at the melting ice sculpture, now just a grotesque lump of slush dripping onto the expensive parquet flooring. "Actually, Seraphina," Arthur said, his voice calm and measured, the voice of a man reading a census report. "According to the 1662 charter and the terms of the 1925 ground lease, any fixtures permanently attached to the land become the property of the freeholder upon lease expiry. The house is mine. The chandeliers are mine. Even the wine cellar is mine." He turned to the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the abrupt end to the festivities. But as the new owner of this estate, I must insist that the premises be vacated immediately. The current tenants are trespassing." It was brutal in its politeness. The senators and tech moguls didn't argue. They didn't even finish their drinks. They set glasses down on trays with clinking nervous energy and fled toward the coat check. They knew the smell of a sinking ship. While the ballroom emptied with frantic speed, Magnus Sterling was red-faced, screaming into his phone in the corner. "I don't care what time it is. Get the entire legal team out of bed. He has some ancient piece of sheepskin. He thinks he owns the city. Fix it." Mr. Croft, the gray messenger, stood by Arthur like a granite statue. He waited for Magnus to hang up before speaking. Mr. Sterling, Croft said dryly, your legal team is currently housed in the Sterling Tower on 4th Street. That building is also on Penhaligon land. I have already taken the liberty of having the locks changed. They cannot access their offices. Magnus dropped his phone. It hit the marble floor with a crack. And Apex Dynamics, Croft continued, relentless. The company you gifted your daughter tonight. Its manufacturing plant, its data servers, its entire physical infrastructure sits on Blackwood Rise land. You handed her a company that currently has no place to operate. Seraphina stared at the bronze plaque she was still clutching, her $80 million crown. It was worthless. She had mocked Arthur for studying dust, and now dust had risen up and choked her entire empire. The ballroom was empty now, save for the catered staff who were nervously cleaning up, unsure who was paying them. Seraphina, stripped of her audience and her inheritance, tried the only weapon she had left. She walked over to Arthur. She didn't scream. She softened her face into a mask of tearful vulnerability, the look that had made him propose 5 years ago. She reached out, touching the lapel of the cheap tuxedo she had despised hours earlier. Arthur, she whispered, her eyes wide and wet. Baby, please. Look what you're doing to my father. To us. I know I was harsh tonight. I had too much champagne. I was stressed about the announcement. But I love you. We're a team. Don't let this lawyer destroy our marriage over some old piece of paper. It was a masterful performance. 5 years ago, it would have worked. Arthur gently removed her hand from his chest. It felt like peeling off a leech. You called me a fool in front of 500 people, Seraphina, Arthur said softly. You said my life's work was pointless. You said my love was a convenience. He stepped back, putting distance between them. You didn't marry a man, Seraphina. You married a placeholder. And the thing about history is that placeholders eventually get replaced by the real thing. Mr. Croft has a car waiting for you and your father in the driveway. You can take your personal effects, but nothing else. An hour later, the great house was silent. Seraphina's weeping had faded down the driveway in the back of a hired sedan. Magnus' threats had ceased when Croft handed him a temporary restraining order to protect the property. Arthur stood alone in the center of the vast, empty ballroom. The scent of lilies was beginning to stale. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt an immense, crushing weight. For years he had lived in the margins of this life, an observer. Now he was the center. He walked to the huge French windows and looked out over the estate, his estate. Beyond the manicured lawns, the lights of the city twinkled. The financial district, the docks, all built on Blackwood Rise. It was too much to process. He turned away from the view and walked out of the ballroom, through the echoing corridors, until he found the library. It was the only room in the house Seraphina never entered. He sat in his old leather armchair, the vellum charter resting on his lap. He was an archivist. His job was to organize chaos into history. He needed to categorize what had just happened. He wasn't a husband anymore. He wasn't a fool. He ran his fingers over the 300-year-old ink. Hello, grandfather. He whispered to the ghosts in the parchment. I believe we have some work to do. Arthur didn't sleep in the master bedroom. The scent of Seraphina's perfume was too strong there. He slept in a guest room and woke to a silence that felt profound. He checked his phone. The world had exploded while he slept. The Sterling crash. Billionaire empire evicted overnight. The historian's revenge. Who is Arthur Penhaligon? The $80 million joke. Heiress humiliated at her own party. His inbox was full. 500 emails from journalists, distant relatives he'd never met, and the very people who had snubbed him at dinner the night before, all suddenly eager to be his best friend. There was one voicemail from Seraphina. It was 30 seconds of sobbing followed by venomous cursing, ending with a desperate plea for money. Arthur deleted it without finishing it. He showered in a bathroom bigger than his first apartment. He didn't have any clothes here other than his tuxedo, so he put it back on. He looked in the mirror. The man staring back looked tired, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. He needed a suit. A real one. At 10 a.m., a black Rolls-Royce gently pulled up to the front door of the estate. Mr. Croft stepped out. Good morning, Mr. Penhaligon, Croft said, as if they did this every Tuesday. I have arranged meetings with the boards of the major companies currently occupying your land. They are panicked. Their stock prices are in freefall. They need reassurance. Where are we going first? Arthur asked, stepping into the car. The leather smelled of wealth and power. Real power, not the noisy kind the Sterlings had flaunted. Sterling Global Logistics Headquarters, Croft said. The boardroom is waiting. 20 minutes later, Arthur walked into a glass and steel building he had only ever visited to bring Seraphina her forgotten lunch. The receptionist, who usually ignored him, stood up so fast she knocked over her coffee. Upstairs, 12 men in expensive suits sat around a mahogany table, looking like they were awaiting execution. Magnus' chair at the head of the table was empty. Arthur walked into the room. He didn't apologize for being late. He didn't shrink. He walked straight to the head of the table. He placed the vellum charter on the mahogany surface. He sat down in Magnus Sterling's chair. It was uncomfortable, built for a man larger and louder than him. Arthur folded his hands on the table and looked at the terrified board members. "Gentlemen," Arthur said quietly, "my name is Arthur Penhaligon. I am a historian, and I believe it's time we reviewed your lease agreements." "You look terrified, gentlemen," Arthur observed, his voice quiet, lacking the bombast of his predecessor. "You shouldn't be. History is full of regime changes. The transition is usually only bloody when the old guard refuses to accept the new reality." One of the bolder board members, a man named Davies with a perpetually red face, cleared his throat. "Mr. Penhaligon, with respect, this is insanity. The markets are opening in 10 minutes. Sterling stock is already down 40% in pre-market trading. You cannot just seize a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure based on a 300-year-old piece of sheepskin." Arthur lightly touched the vellum charter lying on the table. "I assure you, Mr. Davies, the sheepskin is quite real, as is the law." He leaned back, steepled his fingers. "Magnus ran this company on debt, leverage, and bluster. He built high, but he forgot to check the foundation. I am an archivist. I believe in preservation. I am not here to burn Sterling Global to the ground. I am here to audit it." "An audit?" Davies asked, confused. "Our financials are public." "Not a financial audit," Arthur corrected gently. "A historical one. I want to know what value you actually provide to the world beyond inflating your own stock price. Until I am satisfied with the answer, Sterling Global is operating on a month-to-month tenancy. The eviction notice is paused, not canceled." Mr. Croft stepped forward, placing a single sheet of paper in front of each board member. "The terms of the 1925 lease," Croft explained dryly, "set the annual ground rent for the entire Blackwood Rise district at £100 sterling per annum. A charming historical sum." Arthur smiled faintly. "My ancestors were generous. I am less so." Croft continued. "The new temporary lease agreement reflects current market value for prime downtown real estate, adjusted for inflation, plus a penalty surcharge for a century of deferred maintenance on the land trust." Davies looked at the number on the paper. His face went from red to a sickly shade of gray. This is impossible. This figure represents 60% of our annual net profit. We'd be working entirely for you." "Then I suggest you increase your efficiency, Mr. Davies," Arthur said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You are no longer masters of the universe. You are sharecroppers, and the harvest is due." 5 miles away, near the airport flight path, the air smelled of jet fuel and desperation. Seraphina sat on the lumpy mattress of a budget motel room. The wallpaper was peeling, and the noise of a truck backing up outside was relentless. Magnus sat in the only chair, staring blankly at the television, which was muted but showing endless loops of Arthur's face next to headlines about the Sterling collapse. "Do something, Daddy," Seraphina snapped, her patience frayed to nothing. "Call the mayor. Call the governor. You own them." Magnus didn't turn away from the TV. "I owned them when I had the checkbook, Sarah. The bank froze everything this morning. We are toxic. No one is answering my calls." Seraphina paced the small room, her designer heels catching on the cheap carpet. She had lost $80 million, her home, and her status in a single night. And the architect of her destruction was the man she had kept around as a pet intellectual. "He's weak," Seraphina muttered, more to herself than Magnus. "Arthur is weak. He hates conflict. He hates noise. He's playing tough guy now because he has that lawyer behind him." She stopped pacing. A plan began to form in the wreckage of her ambition. "He cares about reputation," she whispered. "Not the money kind. The moral kind. He thinks he's better than us." She grabbed her phone. Her contacts list was full of people who wouldn't take her call today, but there was one type of person who always answered. "Who are you calling?" Magnus asked dully. "A worm," Seraphina replied, dialing a number. "A slimy little tabloid journalist I used to feed gossip to. Arthur wants to play history? Fine. Let's rewrite his." While Seraphina plotted in the motel, Arthur was touring the Apex Dynamics facility. This was the $80 million prize Seraphina had been promised. It was a gleaming, sterile campus built on the eastern edge of Blackwood Rise. The facility was silent. The workers had been sent home pending the ownership crisis. Arthur walked through labs filled with half-finished prototypes of autonomous drones and AI processors. She didn't even know what they made here, Arthur said sadly to Mr. Croft as they stood in the main server room. At dinner, she said it was the future. She had no idea what the technology actually did. She just wanted the bronze plaque that said CEO. "It is a valuable asset, nonetheless," Croft noted, ever practical. "What do you intend to do with it? Sell it off for parts to pay the estate taxes?" Arthur ran a hand over a sleek server rack. "No, that's what Magnus would do. That's the fool's way, destroying something you don't understand for quick cash." He looked around the high-tech cathedral. "My ancestors leased this land to let others build the future. The Sterlings just built a cash register. We're going to keep Apex, but we're going to change its directive. No more building toys for billionaires. We'll see if these brilliant engineers can solve problems that actually matter." He felt a strange sensation. For 5 years, he had watched Seraphina play with power like a child with a loaded gun. Now, holding the gun himself, he realized how heavy it truly was. The next morning, Arthur awoke in the master bedroom of the Sterling estate. He had finally ordered the staff, who were now enthusiastically employed by him at double their previous wages, to clear out Seraphina's things. The room no longer smelled of her overwhelming perfume. It smelled of beeswax and open windows. He went down to breakfast in the sunroom. Croft was already there, reading a tablet with a grim expression. "We have the first counter move," Croft said, sliding the tablet across the table. It was a digital trash rag site, the kind with shouting headlines and neon borders. The headline read, "The Mad King of Blackwood Rise. Is the alienated husband suffering from a psychotic break?" Sources close to the family say Arthur Penhaligon believes he is a 17th century lord. The article was venomous. It painted Arthur not as a rightful heir, but as a deluded, jealous husband who had snapped after years of being overshadowed by his brilliant wife. It claimed he used forged documents in a desperate attempt to steal her inheritance. It quoted an anonymous source close to Seraphina Sterling detailing Arthur's bizarre, obsessive behavior and detachment from reality. Arthur read it calmly, sipping his tea. "It's crude," Croft said, disgusted. "Liable, certainly. We can sue them into oblivion." "No," Arthur said, putting the tablet down. "That's what Seraphina wants. She wants a messy public fight. She wants to drag me down into the mud where she knows how to fight." He looked out the window at his vast estate. "She called me a fool for living in the past. She's about to learn that the past is the only thing that cannot be slandered." "What are your instructions, Mr. Penhaligon?" Arthur stood up. "Schedule a press conference. Today, at noon, on the front steps. No lawyers. No spokespeople. Just me. It's time the city met its landlord." At exactly 12 o'clock, the heavy oak doors opened. Arthur Penhaligon did not emerge looking like a mad king. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his first purchase with his new, limitless credit, that fit his lean frame perfectly. He looked rested, calm, and terrifyingly sane. "Mr." Croft stood 2 paces behind him, a silent sentinel holding a leather briefcase. Arthur stepped up to the cluster of microphones. The frantic shouting of the press corps died down instantly, quelled by the sheer, quiet gravity he projected. "Good afternoon," Arthur began, his voice amplified, clear, and lacking any trace of the tremor Seraphina used to mock. "I have read the articles circulating this morning. They paint a picture of a jealous husband suffering a psychotic break, clutching forged antiquities." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "If you are looking for a scandal of madness, you will be disappointed," Arthur continued. "I am not a lord, nor do I wish to be one. I am an archivist. My profession relies on the meticulous preservation of facts. So, let us deal in facts. He gestured to Croft, who opened the briefcase and handed Arthur a stack of modern, legal documents, not the vellum charter. These are the land registry records, verified by the High Court this morning, Arthur said, holding them up. The Penhaligon Dormant Trust is recognized by the state. The 1925 ground lease signed by Magnus Sterling's grandfather is a matter of public record. It expired. The land, and all permanent fixtures upon it, have legally reverted to the trust. A reporter from a major financial network shouted, "Mr. Penhaligon, what about the rumors that you are evicting thousands of businesses out of spite?" Arthur looked directly at the camera. "I am evicting no one who respects the land and their contracts. I am, however, auditing the city. For decades, the Sterling Empire acted as a toll booth, extracting wealth from this district while letting its infrastructure decay. As the freeholder, I am lowering the ground rents for small businesses by 30%, effective immediately." A stunned murmur rippled through the press corps. This wasn't the move of a greedy tyrant. It was the move of a benevolent landlord. However, Arthur's voice hardened. The media outlet that published this morning's libelous claims is headquartered in a building on 9th Avenue. That building is on Blackwood Rise. As of this moment, their lease is terminated for violating the good faith and reputational standing clause. They have 24 hours to vacate. Arthur turned and walked back into the house. He didn't need to yell. The mic drop was absolute. In the squalid motel room, the television broadcast of Arthur's press conference played out like a funeral dirge. Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling so violently she dropped her phone. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't looked like a fool. He looked like a man who owned the world and was entirely bored by it. Lowering rents. Magnus scoffed from his chair, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey in his hand. He's a socialist idiot. He's throwing away millions for good PR. He just evicted the Daily Informer with a single sentence, Seraphina whispered, her voice hollow. "Daddy, he's not an idiot. He's excising us. He's cutting off everyone who ever did us a favor." Her phone buzzed. It was an automated text from her Platinum credit card provider. Account frozen. Please contact customer service. She swiped to her banking app. Red numbers. Zeros. "Daddy," she gasped, the air leaving her lungs. "My personal accounts. They're locked. All of them." Magnus didn't look at her. He took another long swig of the whiskey. "The banks called in my margin loans this morning. You're a co-signer on the family trust, Sarah. When my collateral vanished, they came for your liquid assets to cover the spread. We don't have a dime." Seraphina stared at the man who had been her idol, her god. You tied my money to your debts?" "We're a family," Magnus roared, suddenly throwing the bottle against the wall, where it shattered, raining cheap amber liquid onto the carpet. "We build fortresses, remember?" Seraphina looked at the broken glass. For the first time in her life, the illusion of Magnus Sterling broke. He wasn't a titan. He was a gambler who had finally lost, and he had used her chips to place his last bet. Back at the estate, Arthur was deep in the bowels of Magnus Sterling's private study. He had ordered the locks drilled. The room was a monument to ego, dark mahogany, leather, and walls lined with photographs of Magnus shaking hands with politicians. But Arthur wasn't looking at the walls. He was looking at the hidden safe behind a painting, which Croft had just successfully cracked. "Fascinating," Arthur murmured as he pulled out a stack of red ledgers. They weren't digital. Magnus kept his true secrets on paper, believing it was safer from hackers. He spread the ledgers across the desk. They were the internal operational logs for Apex Dynamics, the $80 million company Magnus had gifted Seraphina on the night of the gala. As Arthur read, his blood ran cold. He was an archivist. He knew how to read the spaces between the lines. Apex Dynamics wasn't a tech innovator. It was a shell company. For the past 5 years, Magnus had been taking massive government grants for green energy research, but the money was being funneled into offshore accounts. Worse, the Apex facility on the eastern edge of Blackwood Rise was sitting on top of an illegal, highly toxic chemical dumping ground left over from a Sterling manufacturing plant in the 1990s. "Look at this, Croft." Arthur pointed to a specific date in the ledger. The EPA scheduled a deep soil environmental inspection for Apex Dynamics for next month. Croft adjusted his glasses, reading the fine print. Good God. The cleanup costs. The criminal liability. It would be in the hundreds of millions. It means prison. Exactly, Arthur said, the horrific truth dawning on him. Magnus knew the inspection was coming. He knew the ground lease was expiring. He was trapped. Arthur sat back in Magnus' heavy chair, rubbing his temples. The gala. The grand speech. The passing of the torch. It hadn't been a coronation at all. He didn't give Seraphina the company because she was ready, Arthur whispered, a profound sense of disgust washing over him. He made her CEO so she would be the legally responsible officer when the EPA broke ground. He was setting up his own daughter to take the fall for a federal crime. Croft looked at Arthur, his gray eyes calculating. And if you hadn't taken the land back, she would be facing 30 years in federal prison while her father retired to a non-extradition country. Arthur looked at the bronze plaque that Seraphina had left behind in the ballroom, which a maid had placed on the desk. Seraphina Sterling, CEO. It was a death warrant masquerading as a crown. Seraphina was cruel, vain, and manipulative. She had treated Arthur like a stray dog for 5 years. But she didn't know about the toxic waste. She was guilty of pride, not environmental treason. What do we do with this, Mr. Penhaligon? Croft asked. If we turn it over to the authorities, the Sterling name is ruined forever. But Seraphina will likely go down with him. She signed the acceptance papers at the gala. Arthur looked out the window at the gathering storm clouds. He had the power to destroy her completely. He could let her go to prison. It would be the ultimate revenge for the fool. Gather these ledgers, Mr. Croft, Arthur said softly. Make secure copies. Then, I want you to arrange a meeting. Tell the guards at the front gate that when my wife arrives, and she will arrive soon, they are to let her in. It was pouring rain when the yellow taxi pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate. The driver demanded his fare, but Seraphina had nothing but a maxed-out credit card. She had to leave her designer watch as collateral just to get him to open the door. She walked up the long, winding driveway in the freezing rain. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was plastered to her face. Her expensive silk blouse was ruined. When she reached the heavy oak front doors, she didn't have to knock. They opened silently. A butler, the same butler who used to bring her martinis and ignore Arthur, bowed politely. Mr. Penhaligon is expecting you in the library, madam. Seraphina walked through the halls of the house she had grown up in. It felt entirely alien. The oppressive, gaudy Sterling energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, museum-like stillness. She found Arthur standing by the fireplace in the library. He was reading a book, looking entirely at peace. He didn't look up immediately. He made her stand there, dripping rainwater onto the Persian rug, for a full minute. Arthur, she finally croaked. Her voice was broken. He closed the book and looked at her. There was no gloating in his eyes, no triumphant smirk. There was only a cold, clinical pity that hurt worse than anger. You're ruining the rug, Seraphina, he said quietly. Sit down. She collapsed into a leather wingback chair. The fight was gone. The arrogance had been washed away by reality. I have nothing, she whispered, staring at her shaking hands. My accounts are frozen. The hotel kicked us out. Daddy he's gone. He took the last of the cash and got in a car. He left me. Arthur nodded slowly. Rats are remarkably efficient at sensing when the water is rising. Seraphina looked up, tears finally spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. I was horrible to you, Arthur. I know that. I was blind. But please, you won. You took everything. Just give me enough to disappear. Give me a settlement. I'll sign the divorce papers. I'll never bother you again. Arthur walked over to the desk and picked up the heavy red ledger. He walked back and dropped it onto her lap. The weight of it made her flinch. I didn't take everything, Seraphina, Arthur said, his voice laced with a terrifying sorrow. You never had anything to begin with. You were living in a house of cards, built on land you didn't own, spending money your father didn't have. I know, she sobbed. I know I was a fool. No, Arthur corrected her, leaning down so he was eye level with her. You were cruel, but you were also the mark. Open the ledger, Seraphina. Look at the dates. With trembling fingers, she opened the book. She saw the EPA warnings. She saw the massive payouts to clean up crews that were never hired. She saw the toxic soil reports dated 3 years ago. Apex Dynamics, Arthur whispered. The $80 million crown your father bestowed upon you in front of 500 people. He didn't give it to you because you were his legacy, Seraphina. He gave it to you because the federal inspectors were coming next month, and he needed a CEO to take the criminal liability. Seraphina stared at the numbers, the reality slowly fracturing her mind. He was going to let you go to federal prison for 30 years, Arthur said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow to her ego. You call me a fool, but I was just a man reading books. You were the one willing to die for a king who was actively building your gallows. Seraphina Sterling let out a scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak and horror that echoed through the quiet halls of Blackwood Rise. Arthur didn't offer her a tissue. He didn't try to comfort her. He simply sat back in his leather chair and let the reality of the red ledgers crush the last remnants of her arrogance. He left me to die, Seraphina choked out, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather binding of the book. He kissed my cheek on that stage, gave me that bronze plaque, and he was handing me a prison sentence. Yes, Arthur said, his voice devoid of malice, functioning only as a mirror to the truth. Magnus builds fortresses, Seraphina, but every fortress needs a moat. He was going to use you to drown the federal investigators while he escaped with the offshore accounts. She looked up at him, her mascara running in dark rivers down her pale cheeks. The predator had become the prey. Why are you showing me this, Arthur? You have the lease. You have the estate. If you hand these ledgers to the FBI, I go to prison, and you are finally rid of the Sterling family. Because I am an archivist, Arthur replied softly. I believe in the correct attribution of historical events. You were a terrible wife, Seraphina. You were cruel, vain, and entirely hollow. But you are not an environmental terrorist. You are not a criminal mastermind. You are just a casualty of your father's ego. He slid a sleek, modern smartphone across the desk toward her. I am not going to destroy you for crimes you didn't commit. But I am not going to save you for free, either. You have a choice. You can walk out those doors, and I will hand these ledgers to the authorities tomorrow morning. Or, you can pick up that phone, and we can catch the real king. Seraphina stared at the phone. For 30 years, she had worshipped at the altar of Magnus Sterling. To betray him went against every instinct she had been programmed with. But the red ledger in her lap was an undeniable testament to his betrayal of her. She picked up the phone. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely dial the encrypted number she knew by heart, the one Magnus used only for absolute emergencies. Arthur watched her, his face an unreadable mask. Mr. Croft stepped silently into the room, flanked by two men in dark suits who did not look like private security. They had the stiff, authoritative posture of federal agents. The line rang twice before a gruff, paranoid voice answered. Sarah? I told you not to call this number. The feds are raiding the downtown offices. Daddy, Seraphina said, forcing her voice to tremble just the right amount, injecting it with desperate hope. Daddy, I found it. I got into the house. There was a pause on the line. Found what? The bearer bonds, she lied smoothly, her voice gaining a frantic, greedy edge that Magnus would believe. The ones you hid in the secondary safe behind the wine cellar. Arthur doesn't know about them. He's too busy giving press conferences. Daddy, it's 20 million in untraceable paper. Arthur closed his eyes, listening to his wife lie with the proficiency of a master grifter. It was the very skill he had once despised, now being weaponized for justice. You have them? Magnus' voice shifted, the paranoia replaced by sudden, hungry interest. Are you out of the house? I'm leaving now, Seraphina said. But the city is locked down. The banks won't touch me. Where do I go? The private airstrip on the eastern edge of the Blackwood property, Magnus commanded. I have a charter jet waiting. The pilot was about to take off without me, but 20 million changes the math. Get a cab. Pay him whatever he wants. Meet me at Hangar 4 in 1 hour. Do not fail me, Sarah. The line went dead. Seraphina slowly lowered the phone. She looked at Arthur, her eyes dead and hollow. He's at the airstrip. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour by the time the motorcade of unmarked black SUVs reached the eastern edge of Blackwood Rise. The airstrip, built specifically for the Sterling corporate fleet, was a stark stretch of concrete illuminated by harsh floodlights. In the distance, the engines of a sleek Gulfstream jet were already whining, preparing for a rapid, unauthorized departure. Arthur sat in the back of the lead SUV, Mr. Croft beside him. Seraphina sat opposite them, staring out the tinted window at the rain. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. "He'll check the bag," Seraphina said numbly. "As soon as he sees it's empty, he'll run. He won't get the chance," the lead FBI agent said from the front seat, tapping his earpiece. "We have the perimeter secured. He's boxed in." The SUV pulled up to Hangar 4, its tires hissing on the wet tarmac. Magnus Sterling was standing under the awning of the hangar, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest, looking nervously at the idling jet. When he saw the SUV, a look of immense relief washed over his face. He thought his daughter had arrived with his salvation. He didn't realize she had arrived with his reckoning. Seraphina stepped out of the vehicle first, holding a heavy duffel bag. Magnus took a step toward her, a greedy smile forming on his face. "Sarah, good girl. Give it here, we have to go." Then, Arthur Penhaligon stepped out into the rain. Magnus stopped dead in his tracks. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror as the other doors of the SUVs opened and a dozen armed federal agents poured out, their windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the EPA. Magnus Sterling. The lead agent's voice boomed over a bullhorn, cutting through the roar of the jet engines and the driving rain. "You are under arrest for environmental fraud, embezzlement, and flight to avoid prosecution. Put the briefcase down and place your hands on your head." Magnus didn't drop the briefcase. He looked at Arthur, then at the federal agents, and finally at his daughter. "You," Magnus hissed, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. "You set me up. Your own father." Seraphina dropped the empty duffel bag onto the wet tarmac. She didn't cry. She didn't cower. She simply looked at the man who had tried to bury her alive to save himself. "You gave me a company built on poison, Daddy," she said, her voice carrying over the rain. "You were going to let me rot in a cell. I didn't set you up. I just finally stopped taking the fall." Agents moved in, grabbing Magnus by the arms, forcing him to his knees on the rough concrete. The heavy leather briefcase fell, bursting open to reveal stacks of foreign currency and forged passports. The great titan of industry, the man who had mocked Arthur as a fool just days ago, was pressed face first into the puddles, handcuffs clicking sharply around his wrists. Arthur watched in silence. There was no joy in this victory. It was simply the necessary correction of a historical error. 2 weeks later, the air in Mr. Croft's London-style office was thick with the smell of legal parchment and strong tea. Arthur sat on one side of a long mahogany table. Seraphina sat on the other. She was wearing a simple, unbranded gray dress. The heavy jewelry, the designer bags, the aura of invincibility, it was all gone. She looked older, tired, and remarkably ordinary. Mr. Croft slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward her. "The divorce decree," Croft stated. "As agreed, Mr. Penhaligon has provided the federal prosecutors with the evidence necessary to exonerate you from your father's criminal activities at Apex Dynamics. Magnus Sterling has pled guilty to avoid a drawn-out trial." Seraphina picked up a pen. "And the settlement?" she asked quietly. "There is no settlement," Arthur said, his voice gentle but entirely firm. "You brought no assets into this marriage, Seraphina, and the Sterling wealth was an illusion. However, the Penhaligon Trust has established a modest annuity in your name. It will pay out enough to cover a small apartment and basic living expenses. It is contingent upon you maintaining employment and never speaking to the press regarding the trust." Seraphina stared at the paperwork. For a woman who had once expected to rule an $80 million empire, it was an insulting, humbling allowance. It was the absolute bare minimum required for survival. She looked up at Arthur. "You really are a historian," she whispered bitterly. "You're burying me in the footnotes." "I am giving you a blank page, Seraphina," Arthur corrected her. "What you write on it now is entirely up to you." She signed the papers, her signature small and trembling. Without another word, she stood up, picked up her modest handbag, and walked out of the office, disappearing into the crowded streets of a city she no longer owned. A year later, the skyline of Blackwood Rise had not fallen, but it had changed. Arthur Penhaligon stood on the terrace of the Grand Estate, overlooking the city. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore a simple tweed jacket, a cup of Earl Grey tea in his hand. The tabloids no longer called him the Mad King. They called him the Quiet Guardian. Under his stewardship, the rents on Blackwood Rise had stabilized. The predatory businesses had been legally evicted, replaced by local enterprises, green tech startups, and community centers. The Apex Dynamics facility on the eastern edge of the property was no longer producing vanity projects for billionaires. Arthur had repurposed the entire $80 million infrastructure. It was now the headquarters for the largest environmental soil reclamation project in the country, dedicated to cleaning up the toxic sins of the Sterling era. Mr. Croft stepped onto the terrace, holding a leather-bound folio. "The quarterly reports for the trust, Mr. Penhaligon," Croft said, handing them over. "The cleanup at the Apex site is ahead of schedule, and the new historical archive downtown has seen record attendance." Arthur smiled, taking the folio. He looked down at the city, thriving and breathing under the protection of a 300-year-old piece of vellum. "My grandfather would be pleased," Arthur said softly. He had been called a fool because he preferred the quiet truth of history to the loud lies of the present. But as he watched the sunrise catch the glass of the skyscrapers built upon his land, Arthur knew the ultimate truth. The fools are the ones who believe they can build an empire without a foundation. The archivist had not just reclaimed his history. He had finally begun to write the future.